Do you struggle to sleep at night? Perhaps it's because your partner needs something to combat their snoring problem. Are you confused about which supplements you should be taking? Do you want to find the right kind of exercise equipment for your home? Or maybe you're just looking for the best electric shaver. Which has hundreds of product reviews to keep you fit, eat well, sleep better, and everything in between. Just head to which.co.uk/health to read our expert insight and independent reviews. Get expert advice and recommendations to live your best life every day with Which.
Last week's budget may have left you with more questions than answers. Well, today we'll be answering your burning questions. Welcome to Which Money. Hello, I'm Lucia Ariano, and with me today we have Sam Richardson, Deputy Editor of Which Money. Hello, Sam.
Hi, Lucia.
And Emma Wall. Emma Wall is the Chief Investment Strategist at Hargreaves Lansdown. Hi, Emma.
Hello.
Well, thank you both for joining us today. I mean, how was the budget for both of you to start with? Was it what you were expecting?
Logistically, it was quite a lot because I was sort of pinging all over the country to meet with clients and fulfill kind of broadcast opportunities. I'd say the budget itself, I don't think I'd go as far as saying it was a damp squib, but the markets were certainly sanguine in the way that they reacted. So there were no rabbit out of the hat policies. There were big ones anyway. And obviously the major manifesto pledges not to change those kind of top 3-4 taxes were upheld. But there were certainly some things which were unexpected, such as change the tax relief on VCT. We expected the cash ISA limit to be changed, but we weren't sure exactly to what limit, and the fact that, there were changes for different age groups, for example. And although it was rumoured that income tax thresholds were going to be frozen, we didn't know until when. So there were certainly still some surprises, but as I said, the market reaction was pretty positive initially.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, the cash ISA cut was expected, but there's just so many knock-on effects, and it's going to take almost 2 years to kick in. Same with savings tax as well. So it's just left us with loads and loads of questions, and perhaps a little bit of a distraction for people and how they arrange their finances when something's quite far away, and there's always the possibility that some of these policies will be changed or dropped entirely.
Well, we'll be unpicking some of the things that you've already mentioned as we go through today's show. And last week we asked for your questions and we were inundated. So thank you. We're going to get through as many of those as we can today. I should say we're not able to answer specific questions that relate to your specific circumstances, but the Which Money helpline is there for that. If you're not already a member, you can sign up for 25% off the usual price by clicking the link in the show notes. We'll get a link to that there. Okay, so shall we start then? So Katie asks, does the limit apply to cash ISAs held in QMMFs on investment platforms? These are marketed as cash ISAs, for example, Trading 212, CMC Invest, Money Farm, but strictly speaking, these are government bonds. Emma, qualifying money market funds I've got here, that's what we're talking about. Are they government bonds? What are they?
They are described as cash-like instruments, which is where the confusion comes in. But technically, yes, they are an investment. And they're quite often used for people within sort of tax-efficient and taxable investment accounts when they want to keep their powder dry, for example, they're holding some money to one side before entering the market, or as part of a de-risking strategy. And they have been very attractive over recent years because they've been paying pretty attractive rates of interest as interest rates have been higher. We would always caveat that they are not cash. They are more risky than cash, as with any investment. And historically, there have been some occasions where money market funds have fallen in value, whereas cash obviously holds its value. The answer specifically to the question is we don't know yet. Mm-hmm. So there is a consultation in which the question of money market funds, as well as actually cash on platforms, so actual cash held on accounts, how that will be treated within the new cash ISA rules. So we will hope to be finding out in the next 6 months once the consultation is complete.
And a little context to that question. What did happen to cash ISAs? How did they crop up in last week's budget?
So currently the limit annually for an ISA, whether it's a stocks and shares ISA or whether it's a cash ISA, is £20,000 a year. What the Chancellor announced is, as part of the government's policy to encourage more people to invest, they will actually be capping the cash ISA limit at £12,000 a year. If you hold more than £12,000 in cash within that limit, then you will be taxed. Because obviously the attraction of a cash ISA is that you are not taxed on any capital gains or any income. So those changes will be coming into place from 2027.
QMMF, it's a bit of a mouthful. We haven't spoken about those before on the show. I mean, is there any advice you'd give there on, how to pick the right one, or just any advice at all really on those?
Well, it's a fund, so as with any fund selection, it's very important to understand the provider. The large providers who have lots of liquidity, who are running large, money market funds, and therefore placing good deals within the market would always be our preference. You can find out about the government guidelines, or rather the Bank of England guidelines, on what liquidity you should look for within a money market fund, because there was a consultation online, but we'd always say go with one of the large and well-known providers.
Now, sticking with savings, we've got a question here from John. So John asks, what rates of tax will someone pay, A, on their non-interest income, and B, on their interest income when the total of their non-interest income and interest income exceeds the higher rate threshold?
I think there's a bit of confusion around this question, and I completely understand. There were a raft of policies that were announced last week. And the two which he's talking about here are the fact that income thresholds are going to be frozen. And that means the amount that you earn after which you pay a certain level of tax. Now, the government had said last year that they were actually going to lift the threshold freezes which had been in place from the Conservative government next year. This is no longer going to be the case, or rather next tax year from 2027. This is no longer going to be the case, and they're actually going to freeze these thresholds until 3031, or the end of the Parliament. So the threshold at which you pay the high rate of tax remains the same. So there actually are no changes to that, because that's the point. And it's actually going to drag quite a lot of more people into paying tax. There was some statistic from the Liberal Democrats which suggested that actually freezing the thresholds until 3031 will take a further 2 million pensioners into paying tax. We've later had the news actually from the Chancellor that if your income is only state pension, you'll not be affected by that. You won't have to pay income tax. I digress. The point is the thresholds are frozen, and so therefore actually you pay the high rate of 40% on income within the higher tax band, which will remain the same after 2027, so no changes there. On the savings, there will be changes, because actually what was announced is there's an additional 2 percentage points added to the rate of tax that you pay on taxable income.
How much you can earn tax-free depends on your tax band. So can you outline the difference there?
So everybody up to a certain point is entitled to a personal allowance, and that's income that you can earn before you are taxed. And that after which, however, if you earn more than the higher rate of tax, so more than £100,000, this starts to get eroded. So there's this sort of additional tax rate of around 62% for people earning over 100 grand, between 100 grand and 125 grand, at which point you have no personal allowance. Similarly, in the way that you lose your personal allowance after a certain amount of income, you also lose your tax-free savings allowance after a certain amount of income. So it's £1,000 for basic rate taxpayers, and that's what the interest that you can earn over and above your cash ISA limit. It's £500 for higher rate taxpayers, and for additional rate taxpayers, there is no savings allowance.
I hope that's answered your question, John. Well, sticking with ISAs then for a moment, we have a question from another John. Did the Chancellor miss an opportunity in regards to older people holding stocks and shares ISAs? There's still no route of safety for older holders of stocks and shares ISAs, which have performed well. Now, a second section to this question, the FSCS limit increase of 120k helps a little, but a holder of, say, 1 million in a stocks and shares ISA would need 9 cash ISAs with 120k in 8 of them to keep their money safe from stock market crashes. Emma, there's a lot here. Where should we start?
I think I'd like to answer this question in 2 different ways, because they're talking about 2 different allowances here. They're talking about the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, and then they're talking about the changes to the ISA allowance. So if I start with the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme is designed to support individuals in the case of a provider of a financial product going bust. So that is not a stock market crash. That doesn't mean if you buy a UK equity fund, for example, and the FTSE 100 crashes, the Financial Services Compensation Scheme is not going to recompense you in that case. If, however, the asset manager that you've bought that off, or indeed the investment platform goes bust, that is where that scheme kicks in. And it's a scheme that came into pass because of the global financial crisis, where we did see banks fail and people lose their savings. So it's a stopgap. What I would say is if you want to hold all of your money in cash, you can transfer it from a stocks and shares ISA to a cash ISA. The limit, the annual limit is changing, but your ability to move money between those types of ISAs is not changing. So I wouldn't advocate it for reasons I'll come on to. But if you had £1 million worth of savings that you've built up through utilising a stocks and shares ISA, you could transfer that into a cash ISA. And in order to help you manage across those different providers, if you wanted to max out your allowances within the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, you could use a multi-bank ISA. Savings platforms provide these. Ours does indeed, Active Savings. And so actually you can manage your money in one place. Now, the reason I wouldn't advocate moving all of your stocks and shares ISAs into a cash ISA is because retirement is often quite a lengthy and hopefully enjoyable experience. So just because you turn 65 or 67 as the retirement age increases, doesn't mean actually your need for assets to what we call accumulate or grow changes. Instead, what we would advocate is taking a lifestyling approach. And that means really de-risking your portfolio. So if, for example, you had all your investments in equities, which is quite a high risk asset, think about moving some of it into cash, some of it into something like bonds, particularly government bonds or gilts, which are very low risk assets, and spreading some risk. If you need some help with portfolio diversification and balancing, we would always say go and speak to a financial advisor. But there are some basic materials that are out there that can help you at least understand what a risk asset is, a higher risk asset is, and a lower risk asset is. So those two things are slightly separate, but hopefully you've answered both of them.
Okay, well, let's move on now to property, or the realms of property. Sue asks, I am concerned about the tax that will be applied to houses over £2 million. The current value of my property is about 1.8, so it is close and I would find it difficult to pay extra tax. How will the value be calculated?
Yeah, we've had so many questions about the mansion tax. Seems to really worry people. Let's go through the basics. It's only going to be in England as things stand, though the other devolved governments could look into this. It will only be introduced in April 2028. And we're still going to have a public consultation on what it will actually look like, which is meant to take place early next year. What they've already said is it will not be based on council tax bands. It doesn't matter if you're in, say, the very high bands at the moment, like H. What matters is a separate valuation that will be carried out by the Valuation Office Agency. And they will do that to attempt to see what was the value of your house in 2026. It will put houses above the 2 million mark into 4 bands. And the actual mansion tax itself, the amount you pay, will be increased by inflation each year from 2029 to 30 onwards. And the thresholds will be reviewed every 5 years. I suppose just to talk to Sue's case directly here, if her house is valued at £1.8 million now, for it to get to £2 million would require over 10% growth in the space of a year, given it's the 2026 values that will matter. So hopefully it shouldn't be an issue for her. What's already been anticipated is loads of people appealing. You know, they'll say, okay, my house wasn't valued at £2 million very recently. Why have you suddenly put it into this bracket? How those appeals will be treated, we're still not sure about. People already can appeal about their council tax, and sometimes that gets changed. But I think I would say to Sue, you know, don't worry too much now, because that is quite a sizable gap, £200,000. But, you know, to keep an eye on the consultation next year and the actual rules that end up in place.
And we have another question, actually, a few questions on this area, but this is a really interesting one that Ellen asks. I live in a leasehold flat, definitely well under 2 million, but my landlord owns the whole building, which consists of 3 separate flats. Would this property be subject to the new mansion tax? And if so, can the landlord pass part of the annual mansion tax on to me?
Yeah, I saw this question and got temporarily terrified on behalf of leaseholders, which are very recently was one, because they often seem to get quite a raw deal. But in this case, we're quite confident that Ellen wouldn't be at risk. We're still waiting the Treasury's kind of reply on this one, but what we're quite sure of is that a property in this case is the flat, not the overall building it's in. It's the value of the flat itself that counts, not the value of the overall building. If you owned a flat that was worth over 2 million as a leaseholder, we believe that you would be the one to be on the hook. You were the one who owns it during your leaseholder property, even if you don't technically own the building or the land it's on. But in Ellen's case, the cost of the overall building isn't an issue. The fact it's all divided into flats all below 2 million hopefully means that none of them would be subject to mansion tax.
That is a relief. Okay, another one from Susan here. Most councils are now doubling or more the council tax chargeable on second homes. Will they be able to double the mansion tax element too?
So the short answer is no, and we did check this with the Treasury. What would happen is that a second home that was worth £2 million would pay its normal council tax, plus the second home premium on that amount, plus the mansion tax, which would add up to quite a bill. But I suppose if you own a second home worth than £2 million, you could hopefully afford it.
One here from Anita, who asks, who is going to pay for the valuations of all properties in council tax bands F, G and H?
So just to come back to my point that the high value tax, the mansion tax, isn't actually being applied by the council tax band you're in. So actually those council tax bands, we can put them to one side. It's the valuation office agency which will conduct the valuations of who ends up being in the mansion tax. They are part of central government. We've also seen a note that local authorities will be compensated by central government for the additional costs of administering the mansion tax. So it's not something that's likely to fall on homeowners.
And one slightly different here, but Steve asks, does the landlord tax increase also apply to those who let properties for furnished holiday lets, including those whose properties are registered as a small business?
So the answer to the first part, does it apply to furnished holiday lets, is yes. Those count as property income. That includes Airbnb. The question, if the property is registered as a small business, is no. We're pretty sure on that. Instead, that business would pay corporation tax. This is likely to accelerate the kind of movement of landlords into setting up small businesses to own their properties rather than drawing the income directly, as there's so many tax advantages to doing that now.
And let's move on now then to inheritance tax. I have one here from Mary who simply asks, is there any change to inheritance tax? And we had a similar one from Hassan who asks, I have not heard anything about inheritance taxes like nil rate ban, residence nil rate ban, gifting and the 7-year survival rules.
Every budget I search all the documents for mentions of inheritance tax. It's such a big concern for everyone and very rarely seems to change. Look, the basic answer to this is no, there's not been any change to thresholds at which you start paying inheritance tax, which is the really crucial one, right? Less than 5% of deaths result in inheritance tax bill at the moment. There's not been any changes to the gifts that you can give away tax-free, which is really important, or the 7-year survival rule, i.e. if you make a gift more than 7 years before you die, it isn't taxed. There are some smaller changes which worth taking note of. So the thresholds at which you start paying tax have been frozen until 2031. In theory, though this never seems to happen anymore, they would have risen by inflation in the future. And to take account, people's homes are getting more valuable over the years. But they'll be frozen until 2031, and I could certainly see them being frozen beyond that. Charitable donations must now go directly to a UK charity. The reason this is relevant is charitable donations themselves are not subject to inheritance tax. They can also reduce the size of your estate, so it might not go above the thresholds. And they can also get you a reduced rate of inheritance tax on the rest of your estate. But there was some changes, but essentially gifts to some sort of trust and no longer tax-free. This probably won't be relevant to that many people. There's a change with agricultural property relief and business property relief. So if you want to pass on a business, or very controversially at the moment, pass on a farm. This is what farmers are very angry about. But essentially, there's a £1 million tax-free allowance. You can now pass this to your spouse or civil partner. So it should make it easier for couples where they own a business or a farm to pass that on with minimal kind of tax paid. Okay, here's a really big one with inheritance tax that didn't change this budget, but it did change last budget, and almost everyone over a certain age needs to know about it. From April 2027, defined contribution pension pots will be included in your estate for inheritance tax purposes if you die over the age of 75. If you think about it, your pension is probably your second most valuable asset after your home. You might not think your home is valuable enough to get you an inheritance tax bill. Your pension could easily push you over that threshold. That is still happening. There's no news of that being cancelled. So I'd really encourage, all listeners who are worried about inheritance tax, look at the size of their pension, work out if they could be due a bill, and perhaps think about, if I wanted to give money to, loved ones, should I get those plans in motion sooner rather than later? Because those gifting allowances are still really generous, but who knows, perhaps next budget they start to curb those. So definitely look into that.
Let's move on to pensions now. Jane asks here, I thought I heard something about those who draw their state pension while living abroad. I have not been able to find anything further about this. Was there a comment or did I miss here?
Jane, I was in exactly the same position as you. I kind of heard it, then kind of forgotten about it and went and looked into it when you asked. Yeah, this was quite a big change for expats. Essentially, previously, if you'd left the UK and you'd spent at least 3 years in the UK, you could then pay national insurance contributions at the rate of £182 per year for 35 years, and you would get a full state pension, full UK state pension. I saw one estimate that you would be in profit within 6 months of drawing the state pension, i.e. you get so much money out of the state pension compared to what you paid in. They have curbed this. From April next year, you will have to pay £910 a year, and you'll have to have lived in the UK for at least 10 years. Essentially, they're making you pay a different sort of national insurance contribution, class 3 rather than class 2. So it will make it a lot tougher for those expats. It does sound like the system was very generous before.
And we have a question here on electric vehicle tax. David asks, how is the new hybrid tax on cars going to work? While John asks, it seems to me that the new electric vehicle tax could be fairer by taking into account the consumption of the car.
Yeah, this was another journey of discovery for me. Our cars team are wonderful on this subject. Electric vehicles already are subject to tax, but they're subject to vehicle excise duty, which is commonly known as road tax. And they've been subject to it since April this year, £195 per year. But of course, the electric vehicle, you don't pay fuel duty because you don't use any fuel. And fuel duty plays a massive role in kind of paying for our roads and all those potholes that need repairing. What's going to happen is starting in April 2028, you will have to pay 3 pence per mile for driving your electric car. That apparently is half the rate that applies for petrol through fuel duty. An EV driver accruing 8,000 miles a year would pay about £20 a month or £240 annually, compared to about £40 per month in fuel duty. Plug-in electric vehicle drivers will also have to pay this per mile charge at 1.5p per mile. The reason that's half as much is, of course, they also pay fuel duty, so it's meant to keep it fair for them. For existing cars, this is where it gets a little bit complicated. You'll be asked to estimate your mileage each year, and then this will be compared with your mileage reading in your MOT at the end of the year, and you might have to, either pay more or get a refund. For cars under 3 years old where you don't need an MOT, there'll be anniversary checks of your mileage. And for new cars, it's suggested that dealerships could estimate the mileage and thus the tax you'll need to pay. So it is quite a shift, and it'd be good to get kind of more details in advance of that starting about how they're going to make it easy for people. To go to John's question, there is no difference in the road tax you would have to pay for driving a very large electric vehicle compared to a very small one. That is quite an interesting one because, of course, with fuel tax, if you have a large car, it's probably less efficient. You use more fuel, you pay more fuel tax. I would note that electric vehicles with a list price, like a new car price of 50,000 or more, have to pay an extra road tax already, and that's £425 per year. So, don't get that enormous electric SUV just yet if you're worried about the bills.
Well, we've whizzed through so many topics and we are close to wrapping up. Emma, is there anything that you'd like to add on anything that we've mentioned? I did see you smiling and nodding when we were talking about council tax bans and the changes there. But is there anything that we've talked about or otherwise that you'd like to bring up?
I was surprised there were no questions on salary sacrifice. That would be, I'd say, the sort of big budget measure that we think impacts quite a lot of people. Most people who are employed by a large corporation will have been potentially offered the opportunity to max out their pension contributions through salary sacrifice. And we think this has been a great incentive for people taking control of their financial futures because they've been able to pay in pre-tax, both income tax and national insurance. And also, more crucially, their employers have been able to do that too. And so actually we've seen some, not across everyone, but some large firms having really generous matching policies where if you pay into a pension, your employer will match that. We do have some concerns around some of that generosity and whether now that employers will have to pay national insurance on those contributions, whether some of those sort of promises to employees get eroded and actually the long-term potential implications of people's financial future because simply they are saving less and obviously the power of compounding works with maximised contributions. And so that would be the one thing that I would highlight that we haven't covered today. And I'd really encourage people, if possible, to continue the contributions that they're making today, because any contributions that you lessen today will have a long-term impact on your income in retirement.
I mean, have you found that people might not know if they're paying into their pension through one of those types of schemes?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And so, you should get at least annual letters, and it should be available on, through your kind of workplace to gather information about how you pay into your pension. As I said, most large employers do utilise salary sacrifice. If you work for a smaller business or indeed you're self-employed, some of the administrative elements of it may not be in place. And obviously for the self-employed, it's definitely not the case. But yeah, definitely worth finding out and thinking about whether you are planning to make any changes to your contributions, and also as the consultation sort of finalises, understanding what your employer tends to do as well.
Really pleased you brought that up. And Sam, is there anything else that you'd like to re-mention or to say from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, people think a lot about the increases in savings and dividend tax. And I would challenge anyone listening here, can you basically not pay a penny of either of those when they kick in next year and 2027 respectively? You have these tax-free allowances, particularly for savings. You still have access to ISAs. You could put the money into your pension as well. You could even buy, premium bonds where the prizes are tax-free. I really don't think that people, should be, if they're putting the right steps in place, should be paying a penny in savings interest tax, if they're doing the right things. I think with dividends now and investments, if you aren't putting investments into an ISA or a pension, there's something really wrong there, because those are so important to kind of tax-proof yourself. Don't forget about capital gains tax when you eventually want to cash in your investments. You have, with dividend tax, you've got a couple of months to get, your ducks in a row. With the cash ISA and savings tax changes, that's not till April 2027. So, take this weekend to just look at your savings, look at your investments. It should be fine. You've got time to move the money.
I wholeheartedly agree. These allowances are there to be used, and annually they use it or lose it, even without the government changing the allowances. If you don't use this year's tax allowance, you don't get to use it next. So I'd wholeheartedly agree.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Which, the UK's consumer champion. You can find plenty more advice about what we discussed today in the show notes. There you'll also find a link to become a Which member for 50% off the usual price, an offer exclusively available to you, our podcast listeners. Joining Which will not only give you access to our product reviews, our app, one-to-one personalised buying advice, and every issue of Which magazine across the year, but you'll also be helping us to make life simpler, fairer, and safer for everyone. Don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you're listening. That way you'll be notified whenever we release a new episode of Which Money, Which Shorts, or any other podcast that we make for you. And if you want to get in touch with us, then follow us on social media at Which UK or drop us an email to podcast@which.co.uk. See you next time.
If you're enjoying this podcast from us here at Which, then why not become a Which member? Right now, we've got a special offer, especially for podcast listeners, meaning you can choose any of our 3 membership tiers for 50% off the usual price. Starting at just £39.50 for a full year, you can get Which magazine delivered direct to your door. For the same price, you could also choose a digital Which subscription, giving you access to all of our product reviews, the Which app, and the digital edition of Which magazine. What's more, you'll also be able to use the Ask Which service for personalised one-to-one buying advice. Or why not get a full access Which subscription for just £49.50 for a full year? Don't forget, that's 50% off the usual price. To join Which or to find out more, just head to which.co.uk/podcast offer. That's which.co.uk/podcast offer, or click the link in the description for today's podcast for 50% off a Which annual subscription.